dire for Aetius personally, and real fighting might be required. But Rua was still happy to provide his old friend with the troops he needed. The possible upside was too tantalizing to pass up. If Aetius won, he would be the master of the Western Empire, and who doesn't like being close personal friends with the master of the Western Empire? Meanwhile, back in Italy, it became clear that Bonifacius' victory had not come without a price. The general himself had been wounded in the fighting, and after lingering for a few months, Bonifacius succumbed to his injuries in the autumn of 432. He was succeeded by his son Sebastianus, whose first assignment was to ensure that Aetius stayed exiled. In this, he was entirely unsuccessful. It is unclear to me whether Aetius returned to Italy in late 432 or early 433, but whichever it was, when he did come back, he came at the head of a powerful Hun army. This new army easily swept aside the Italian forces, and Aetius forced his way into Ravenna, where he humbly asked to be reinstated to his old position. And how could Placidia say no, what with how nicely Aetius was asking it all? Aetius completed his takeover of the West by taking title of all the lands that had been owned by Bonifacius, and then, kind of creepily, marrying his late rival's widow, which I can't imagine was any fun for her at all. So now Aetius was the most powerful soldier and statesman in the West. He was, just as Rua had hoped, the master of the Western Empire. And Flavius Aetius would not relinquish this title for a good 20 years, making him easily one of the most important men of the 5th century, and, when you get right down to it, one of the most important men in the whole of Roman history. He would manage the West through its final phase of semi-stability, and then successfully see it through one last great crisis before he died. That crisis, of course, has a name and a face, and they will be shown to us for the first time next week. Because as happy as Rua must have been to see his old friend Aetius attain such great heights, he did not live to enjoy the fruits of his friendship. Dying in 434, Rua would be succeeded by his two nephews, an elder brother known as Bleda, or Buda, whose name, incidentally, is where scholars think the Buddha in Budapest is derived from, and a younger brother, whose name is synonymous with all that is great and terrible, Attila the Hun. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 169, Huns and Vandals and Goths, oh my. As you know, the Huns have been playing a major role in Roman politics for the last 50 years at least. Arriving on the Hungarian plain back in the 370s, the Huns sparked a multi-generational migration of the former native tribes of the region into Roman territory, which led to, among other things, the Battle of Adrianople, the mass invasion of 406, the sack of Rome, and now the Vandal takeover of North Africa. This is to say nothing of the endless revolts, civil wars, and assassinations all this demographic unrest had forced the Romans to deal with within their own ranks. But for the most part, the Hun impact on the Roman world had thus far been indirect. Aside from the brief abortive thrusts of Olden in the early 400s, the Huns had basically stayed on the north side of the Danube River. Their arrival in the west was an epoch-defining event for the Romans, sure, but mostly in a domino-toppling sort of way, rather than a I'm punching you directly in the face sort of way. But that was all about to change. New leaders were about to take over the Huns, and new leadership meant new policies, and new policies meant new headaches for the Roman Empire. Headaches caused by repeated Hun punches to the face. When Uldin died in 412, you'll recall that his coalition split into three major factions. Each pursued its own course and was led by its own leaders for the next decade or so, but by the mid-420s they began recoalescing around a pair of brother kings, who I introduced briefly last week, Oktar and Rua. This re-centralization of Hun power naturally led the brothers to think up ways to use their new strength to their advantage, and they hit upon the idea of making the Romans pay for the privilege of not being attacked. I don't know if they ever actually planned to follow through on the threats they began issuing to Constantinople, but I kind of like to think that they didn't. That Rua and Oktar were fine with just sitting around. Hey, the Romans don't know that we're fine with just sitting around and doing nothing, so let's see if we can trick them into forking over a bunch of gold. At some point in the mid-420s, they sent envoys down to Constantinople demanding an annual payment of 350 pounds of gold, or we will invade your empire. Yeah, that's the ticket. Do you think they bought it? The Romans did indeed buy it. 350 pounds of gold was a lot, but not backbreaking, and the Huns were awfully menacing, what with their ridiculous horsemanship and crazy accurate archers. So Theodosius II's ministers agreed to the terms, and for the next decade sent along the gold every year, and in return the Huns kept right on doing nothing, which is pretty good work if you can get it. This new status quo endured through Oktar's death around 430, and continued unchanged until the end of Rua's life in 434. Now, it is fairly easy to draw a line in the sand between Rua and Oktar on one side, and Bleda and Attila on the other, and say, well, on this side the Huns were content to indirectly influence Roman politics, and on this side they dove headfirst into direct action. But it's not quite that simple. For one thing, when you get right down to it, granting Aetius's request for a field army to go drive Bonifacius from power isn't exactly indirect influence, but you could make the case that it really was. But what is less debatable is the fact that Rua almost certainly died on the Roman side of the Danube. And what was he doing on the Roman side of the Danube? Was he on some diplomatic mission? Doing some sightseeing? No, he was leading a Hun invasion of Moesia. So the aggressive posture of the Huns in the middle 5th century cannot be solely attributed to Attila. Clearly, they were moving in that direction already. But that said, Attila and his brother Bleda were definitely more aggressive than Rua and Oktar had been. This most recent campaign into Roman territory, for example, was mostly a case of hot pursuit taking the Huns across the border than it was an attack on the Romans per se. A few subject tribes had tried to break free of Hun domination by fleeing into the empire, and rather than let them go, Rua had launched a pursuit. International borders and treaties be damned. So when he died, and Bleda and Attila succeeded him, they and a Hun army were actually in Roman territory, which the court of Constantinople was not at all happy about. But when imperial envoys went out to remind Rua that, hey, this is exactly the sort of thing we've been paying you not to do, they were greeted instead by the newly ascended kings Bleda and Attila, who were looking to flex their muscles politically. The brothers were happy to leave, they said, but only after the Romans agreed to double the annual indemnity to 700 pounds of gold, and open up Roman markets to Hun traders without barrier or restriction. 700 pounds of gold was a lot more than 350 pounds of gold, but given the circumstances and a cold calculation of how disastrous a prolonged war with the Huns would be, the envoys agreed to the terms, and the Huns withdrew back to their side of the Danube. Satisfied with the barrel they had just laid the Romans over, Bleda and Attila let the empire alone for the time being, and instead turned their attention to the other great gold egg-laying goose, the Sassanids. And though it would be 5 years before the Huns turned their attention back to Rome, Attila had learned a very specific lesson from this first encounter with the Romans. They could be pushed around, and fairly easily at that. Now, one of the circumstances that had led Constantinople to so readily agree to pay the Huns rather than fight them was the fact that they had recently dispatched a good chunk of their available forces to take care of a problem that technically wasn't really their problem at all. But given how depleted and at each other's throats the Western forces were, somebody had to do something about the Vandal invasion of North Africa. So in 431, Theodosius II had sent troops to North Africa to deal with what was really his cousin Valentinian's problem. The eastern expedition was led by the general Aspar, who was the son of Ardabor, the general who had gotten Valentinian onto the throne in the first place. Aspar and his men were not able to roll back the Vandal tide, but they were able to stabilize the situation and pave the way for a treaty between Ravenna and the Vandals. Brokered by Aspar in 435, the treaty ceded the Vandals control of Numidia. In exchange, the Vandals agreed to stay out of the province of Africa, thus preserving, at least for now, Italy's access to the grain it so badly needed. Deal with this Vandals in hand, Flavius Aetius, now the dominant general and statesman in the West, was able to turn his attention back to Gaul, which he was intent on reimposing order upon. If he could get a permanent handle on the myriad independent tribes who now form the core of the region's population, he might be able to turn his attention more fully to North Africa and expel the Vandals once and for all. But despite his best efforts, the provinces of Western Europe would remain a slippery snake that would defy Aetius' attempt to turn his back on them time and time again. This time, it was the Burgundians in northern Gaul who raised Aetius' blood pressure. Having been granted lands by Honorius in the settlements following the fall of Jovinus, the Burgundians were now looking to extend their territory westward and began menacing their neighbors in Gallia Belgica. Aetius led a Roman army against the Burgundians in 436, and the general succeeded in pushing them back into their agreed-upon place in the world. The victory was complete enough that the Burgundians agreed not only to stay put, but also to pay what amounted to a fine for breaking the peace. Towards the end of it, the Roman army withdrew, and the Burgundians got to work hustling up the cash they had agreed to pay. But that was not the end of it, at least not for Aetius. Agreements were nice, but agreements could be broken. Aetius wanted a more permanent solution to the problem of Burgundian aggression. So he contacted some old friends in the Huns and asked them if they wanted to make a quick buck. The job was simple: ride into the territory of the Burgundians and slaughter them. Every last one of them. The Huns agreed because it's not like they had scruples about this sort of thing, and in 437, a horde of them rode into town at high speed and commenced a slaughtering. Some 20,000 Burgundians were killed in the ensuing massacre, including the old king Gundahar, who, you'll recall, was once upon a time one of the major powers backing Jovinus.